It's the most expensive bridge in Canadian history, yet the Americans didn't pay a single dime. Built to reroute billions in trade, the Gordie Howe International Bridge is supposed to be North America's next economic superhighway. But with political tensions, Trump-era tariffs, and collapsing supply chains, this $4.6 billion bet might be crumbling before it even opens. So why is the whole world watching a bridge between Detroit and Windsor? It was never supposed to be Canada's burden alone, but back in the early 2000s, as trade between the US and Canada surged past $400 billion a year, one bridge, nearly 100 years old, was carrying the weight of two nations' economies. That bridge, the Ambassador Bridge, a rusting, privately owned choke point connecting Detroit, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario. For decades, the Ambassador Bridge did its job, but over time it became less of a bridge and more of a bottleneck. One study warned it was the single most important trade corridor in North America. Yet it sat under the control of a single billionaire. Canada didn't like that. Neither did the automakers who relied on smooth, uninterrupted crossings. In 2012, something snapped. Canada decided it would front the entire bill, over $4.6 billion USD, to build a second bridge, modern and massive, that wouldn't be held hostage by private owners or political red tape. And they wouldn't wait for Washington to help. That decision wasn't just about logistics. It was a strategic move, a national response to what many called a quiet economic emergency. At the time, Ontario's auto industry, the economic engine of Canada, was bleeding jobs. Plants were shutting down. Assembly lines were being moved to the US and Mexico. And while politicians talked about innovation and resilience, the truth was brutal. Canada was losing leverage in the North American supply chain. So the Gordie Howe Bridge became something more than infrastructure. It became a last-ditch lifeline, a $4.6 billion gamble to reinforce Canada's role in a fragile, highly integrated auto industry. The goal? Streamline trade, secure faster customs clearance, and restore confidence that Canada could still compete in a continental game increasingly tilted southward. And that gamble wasn't just for appearances. Studies projected that the new bridge would cut crossing times by up to 20 minutes per truck, potentially saving the freight industry over $1.5 billion in time and fuel costs over 30 years. More than that, it would link Highway 401 in Ontario directly to I-75 in Michigan, creating a seamless supply artery stretching from Montreal to Miami. It was a vision of hyper-efficiency, where auto parts could cross the border 6 or 7 times during production without delay, where Canadian factories could hum with just-in-time deliveries, where blockades and backups wouldn't threaten shutdowns on both sides of the river. But while Canada was building a bridge for the future, the world around it was changing fast. Just as Canada laid the foundation for its bold new bridge, a political earthquake shook the continent. In 2024, Donald Trump won the US presidency with a rallying cry to bring manufacturing jobs back home. To his supporters, the North American trade landscape had been a raw deal. Factories had fled, jobs were vanishing, and trade partners, Canada and Mexico included, were painted as economic threats. It didn't take long for this rhetoric to turn into policy. Tariffs hit first. In a stunning move, Trump's administration rolled out 25% tariffs, starting with steel and aluminum from Canada. Then came the real blow: tariffs on vehicles and auto parts. Suddenly, the very lifeblood of the Windsor-Detroit economy, auto manufacturing, was under siege. Canada hit back with its own 25% tariffs, targeting US-made vehicles. But it was like trying to stop a freight train with a speed bump. This wasn't just a trade disagreement. It was a direct assault on the deeply integrated supply chains that had evolved over decades. Before the tariffs, a car part could cross the border 6 or 7 times before being assembled. A brake system might start in Ontario, travel to Michigan for modifications, head to Mexico for subassembly, then return to Canada for final integration, all without friction. But now, Every single crossing added cost. Every shipment of screws, wiring harnesses, or fuel tanks was suddenly taxed, up to 25%, each time it crossed the border. The result? Chaos. Automakers warned of shutdowns and mass layoffs. Suppliers paused contracts, production slowed. And then came the first public casualty. Stellantis, a major player in North America's auto market, halted production at 2 plants, including its Windsor assembly plant, citing the impact of new US tariffs. The Gordie Howe Bridge was built to ease trade and strengthen supply chains. Instead, it was now opening into a trade war. What once promised to be a high-speed corridor for cross-border commerce was quickly becoming a monument to a system unravelling. And all of this before the first car had ever crossed its 6 new lanes. Even worse, the economic model that justified the bridge's $4.6 billion cost, traffic volume and toll revenue, was suddenly in doubt. Initial planning reports estimated $70.4 million in tolls in year 1 alone. That projection was based on pre-tariff trade flows, with stable supply chains and growing automotive demand. But now traffic was falling, trade was retreating, and political uncertainty was only growing. Experts warned that if tariffs remained, or if automakers moved more production to domestic-only facilities, the Gordie Howe could become a ghost bridge, used but nowhere near capacity. A 6-lane symbol of what could have been. And the scariest part? Canada was footing the bill, alone. While the US dragged its feet on funding the US Customs Plaza, Canada had already committed 6.4 billion Canadian dollars, more than $500 million more than initially expected. Their investment aimed at preserving a relationship that seemed to be unravelling by the day. Suddenly, what was meant to be a gift of unity looked more like an expensive insurance policy against a partner growing increasingly unpredictable. Politics may shift like sand, but steel tells a different story. And the Gordie Howe Bridge, it's not just infrastructure, it's a record breaker, a testament to human ambition, and a challenge hurled at gravity itself. Stretching 2.5 kilometres, 1.5 miles across the Detroit River, the Gordie Howe International Bridge is on track to become the longest cable-stayed bridge in North America. That title alone doesn't do it justice, because this isn't just long, it's monumental. 2 main towers, each 220 metres tall, roughly the height of a 70-storey skyscraper, anchor the structure. These giants aren't just holding the road up, they're holding together a 6-lane superstructure designed to support millions of heavy freight crossings per year and withstand decades of environmental punishment. And here's what sets it apart. Unlike most cross-border bridges, it's fully integrated. That means it includes dedicated US and Canadian customs plazas, over 130 hectares of port infrastructure, and seamless highway connections on both ends. I-75 in Michigan and Highway 401 in Ontario. That's a direct line from Montreal to Miami, uninterrupted. It's a bold vision, logistics without friction, trade without bottlenecks. But getting it built? Nothing short of brutal. The terrain was unforgiving. The Detroit River is deep, fast and unstable, with tricky soil conditions and layered bedrock. Engineers had to drive over 500 massive steel foundation piles, some as deep as 36 metres into the earth, just to support the towers. Each of the 216 stay cables, those sleek, blade-like lines you'll see in drone shots, had to be individually installed, tensioned and anchored with mathematical precision. The margin for error? Practically zero. Wind, weight and water all had their say. And then there was the size of the components themselves. Each main span segment weighed hundreds of tons, too heavy for conventional cranes, too large for typical barges. So engineers turned to modular construction. Segments were built off-site, shipped via river, then lifted into place with custom gantries, one of the most complex lifting operations in North American bridge history. Even during COVID lockdowns, material shortages and labour strikes, construction pressed on. A delay would have added tens of millions in penalties. But more than that, it would have meant delaying hope. Hope for an economy starving for smoother trade. And here's a detail most people miss. The bridge is designed with future tech in mind. Wiring conduits run beneath the lanes for future electric truck charging, fibre optic surveillance, and real-time border data sharing. It's more than concrete, it's digital infrastructure embedded in steel. Yet perhaps the most symbolic detail? There's no pedestrian lane, no walkway, no bike path. This isn't a bridge for people. It's a bridge for commerce, for trucks, for machines. In that way, it perfectly reflects the era it was built for, an age where supply chains mattered more than scenery. Whether or not the Gordie Howe Bridge becomes a financial success is still up for debate. But as a feat of engineering, it's already a triumph, a defiant structure planted in the soil of two nations, reaching across a river that's divided and connected for centuries. The bridge might be named after a hockey player, but it was built like a fortress. It was supposed to open in 2016. Now, almost a decade and $500 million in overruns later, the Gordie Howe Bridge is finally scheduled to open in fall 2025. But as the last cables are secured and final asphalt is poured, a new fear haunts policymakers on both sides of the river. What if no one shows up? That's not just paranoia, it's math. The entire financial model behind the Gordie Howe Bridge is based on toll revenue. According to a 2010 feasibility report, the bridge was projected to bring in $70.4 million in tolls during its first year alone. That projection assumed a world where cross-border trade was growing, supply chains were stable, and traffic would surge with every passing year. But that world, it's gone. Trade between the US and Canada hit $760 billion in 2024. But those numbers mask a deeper truth. The system is becoming less integrated, not more. The new tariffs, introduced during Trump's presidency and echoed by protectionist policies after, have discouraged cross-border production. Automakers are now redesigning supply chains to be domestic, just to avoid the financial risk of future trade disruptions. And when those supply chains shrink, so does traffic. A bridge built for surging freight demand is suddenly staring at the possibility of diminishing returns. Worse still, the Ambassador Bridge, the aging, privately owned workhorse the Gordie Howe was meant to replace, is still very much alive. It already connects the same two cities. It already has customs facilities. And it's not going anywhere, so the region may now have two bridges, with one carrying most of the traffic and the other carrying most of the debt. And here's the twist. Canada paid for all of it. Not just the steel and concrete, but also the US Customs Plaza, a facility on American soil, entirely funded by the Canadian government. They did it to keep the project moving. They did it to preserve trade. They did it because they believed in the vision. But what happens when that vision becomes a relic? Because the Gordie Howe isn't just a project, it's a promise of unity, a promise of economic resilience, a promise that two countries, once rivals and now partners, could invest in their shared future if traffic slows, if tariffs stay, if the Ambassador Bridge continues to dominate the flow of goods. Then the Gordie Howe becomes something else entirely, a $4.6 billion lesson in timing, a monument to a moment in history that may never return. And that's what makes this story so unsettling. Not the numbers, not even the politics, but the symbolism. Because bridges are built to connect, to unite. And this one, named after a man who played for both countries, who wore the maple leaf and the stars and stripes, is now at risk of becoming a symbol of what could have been. A white elephant, towering, beautiful, empty. Bridges don't usually make headlines, but the Gordie Howe Bridge isn't just any crossing. It's $4.6 billion worth of steel, ambition, and geopolitical anxiety, quietly rising between two cities most people outside North America can't even place on a map. And yet, the world is watching, not because of its size or its name, or even its engineering. But because it represents something every global power is now questioning, can cooperation survive in an age of division? When Canada agreed to bankroll the entire project, including the American Customs Plaza, it wasn't just out of desperation. It was out of faith. Faith in free trade, faith in shared destiny, faith in a post-NAFTA world where borders would blur and economies would converge. But that era, the era of integration, is now wobbling on shaky ground. Across the globe, we're seeing the same story unfold. India pulling back on foreign partnerships, the US reshoring manufacturing, China building alliances not through bridges, but through digital firewalls and exclusive trade zones. Even Europe, long a beacon of cross-border unity, is watching nationalist tides rise. And then there's this bridge, this silent, soaring monument on the Detroit River. It was meant to be a model of the future, a megastructure built not for war, but for commerce, collaboration, and speed. But now it risks becoming a relic of a fading dream. That's why policymakers in Brussels, in Beijing, in Brasilia are paying attention. Because the Gordie Howe Bridge is a test case, not of concrete, but of trust. Can two countries intertwined in trade but divided in policy still build something that benefits both? Or does every partnership now come with a price? Already, whispers of the bridge's failure have begun. Economic analysts have floated the term white elephant. Critics have pointed to toll projections that no longer align with reality. Journalists have called it a monument to mistiming. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a mirror, a reflection of where we are as a global society, rushing to build pathways in a world increasingly obsessed with borders. Maybe the Gordie Howe Bridge isn't the mistake. Maybe it's the warning. Because what happens here, between Windsor and Detroit, could echo far beyond North America. If the bridge succeeds, it proves that cross-border cooperation still has muscle, that governments can still invest for the long haul, that trust, even when shaken, can be rebuilt in steel. But if it fails, if traffic slows, if trade sours, if politics continues to poison policy, then this bridge, the longest cable-stayed span in North America, may become the most powerful metaphor of our time. Two towers, a perfect connection, and nothing crossing between them.